Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to be talking about how do we know anything about history or the past and the historical method. And we'll relate it to questions that are relevant to Christianity, obviously, because Christianity is a historical faith. So, it talks about things like the Hebrews crossing the sea, Jesus coming back from the dead, the apostles going around performing miracles. It has a bunch of stuff that it claims happened in the past. And so the question is, how do we know anything about the past? And then what is the historical method? I've talked about stuff like this before, but I think I've learned enough by listening to different audio lectures, audio books, and I've learned a lot more about this in the recent months, and it's been very helpful to also listen to people that I don't agree with, listen to a lot of Bart Ehrman's lecture series, multiple lecture series, and I think I've gotten a much better grasp on this stuff and understanding how it works. And so what I'm going to do is put up on the screen kind of a general summary of the historical method. So what is the historical method? And we'll kind of look at this, and hopefully this will help it make sense. This summary isn't something that I've seen anywhere else. I'm just kind of putting together what I've gathered from different sources to try to help it sort of sum it up. The historical method is basically like the scientific method, but for historians. So it is the way that historians essentially prove what they know or debunk what's wrong about history. Historical method, as best I can tell, generally works in a way that's very similar to the scientific method. What you do is you take a general overview of the data. So you kind of take a general browsing of what you've got. Then you form some sort of basically a theory. It might be better to call it a model. I've heard historians say they prefer to call it just a story, because essentially that's what it is. But they often use the term model, and model or theory or thesis, can work really well for us. So you take a general overview of the evidence that we have. Then from that you form some sort of guess, essentially. So you might say something like this. Here's a simple example, and I've used this example. What I've found is a lot of people have a very, very bad view of the historical method, and a lot of people just go to school and learn history, but they don't learn historical method, and that's very detrimental, because then people can come in and say, so here's an example. I can come up with one model and I could say, all right, aliens built the pyramids in Egypt. Okay, that is a model that's so many people are so familiar with it, and what's fascinating to me is people you think are just normal people, then when you start talking about aliens built the pyramids, you'd be surprised there's always somebody who really thinks that aliens built the pyramids. They get really offended when you question it or doubt it. And part of the issue is people just throw out a sort of a potpourri or a sort of a hodgepodge of little bits and pieces of the historical method that they've gathered from historical documentaries or just their own reasoning, or maybe they read something. And it's not really a complete view of the historical method. It's just little bits and pieces. And they're not really organized or well thought out or well planned out. And so it doesn't really... They can come to all sorts of bad conclusions about history because they've got bits and pieces of good reasoning mixed in with bits and pieces of bad reasoning. and they don't have a complete picture of the proper historical method. And so what I'm going to do is try to give you a complete picture, as best I can tell. I think there'll be a little bit more that you could add, but this should be a fairly comprehensive. So anyway, like I said, you look at the general data. So for example, with our Egypt example, there's a bunch of pyramids in Egypt, and they appear to be really old. Okay, so you propose a model that aliens came to Earth long ago and built them. Okay, and you can propose that model. One of the interesting things you can do is you can propose an anti-model, or if it's a thesis, you can propose an antithesis. Sort of the opposite model, or some sort of competing model, or it might be a direct opposite model. So I could have two models that are being proposed. I could have one, aliens built the pyramids, and the other is humans built the pyramids. Okay, so that kind of gets you going, and then what you do is, once you've got your model sort of created based on a general overview, then you begin to test your model. And it might be helpful to propose some sort of alternative model or an anti-model, a competing model, because as we'll go through this, what you'll see is the methods of testing models sometimes work better when you're not testing the model, but you're testing its alternative. And it may be better to just, in other words, like a lot of the testing methods for the historical method don't function negatively, they only function positively. So they only support a model. And so but they can debunk a model. So for example, if you have aliens built the pyramids, and then you have the alternative is humans built the pyramids, without any alien assistance, then if you provide lots of support for humans built the pyramids, and there's just a lack of support for aliens built the pyramids, then what you've done is you've provided a positive support for your anti-model, or for your alternative model, that then that positive support functions as a negative criticism of the original model where the aliens built the pyramids. So that can be kind of confusing, because it's like you have positive tests and they're functioning negatively in some cases because they're actually functioning positively to support a different model, but then that model itself is the alternative or the opposite of the other model. But anyway, so in our example, we got aliens built the pyramids, humans built the pyramids. Okay, so then the next thing we have are three general guidelines, but just overall general guidelines that you go by. Okay, the first general guideline is plausibility. So it's sort of the first kind of basic test that you have to, before your model even gets off the ground, you have to ask yourself, is the model plausible? Okay, so what does plausibility mean? Plausibility doesn't mean true. It doesn't even, it just means, and it doesn't mean the same thing as possible, because it's certainly possible that aliens, built the pyramids, but it is not plausible that aliens built the pyramids. And the difference is, there is no evidence that aliens exist. So plausibility means that the model is consistent with what we already know. So I'll give you a different example to help you understand it. If you were to say, we can propose two models for why are there poor people in the world today? And one model could be that rich people are oppressing poor people. Well, that model is plausible because we know of plenty of examples in the past where that has totally happened. That the rich and powerful are oppressing the poor. So that model, passes the plausibility, the first hurdle, the first general guideline, I like to call it, or just first sort of basic test. It passes the plausibility test. It doesn't mean that it's true. It's just sort of the first hurdle. But if you say that, mole men from the center of the earth are using their magic, to keep people poor. Okay, that model doesn't pass the plausibility test because there's no evidence that mole men from the center of the earth exist. So you're proposing an implausible explanation. You're going to have to provide some sort of support for the existence of the mole men before you start using them to explain something else. Now it can be confusing because sometimes in your argument you're proposing, like you might be, like, for example, with the Kalam cosmological argument, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to assume you're familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument if you're watching this video. If you are not, sorry. You just have to research that. But in the Kalam cosmological argument, sometimes people mistakenly say that, well, you're proposing God, and God is an implausible explanation for the origin of the universe. And what they fail to understand is God doesn't have to pass the plausibility test, because the Kalam cosmological argument is in and of itself a proof for God's existence. So there's no question. It is establishing God's plausibility. But it's different when you're using, so for example, mole men from the center of the earth to explain economic inequality on the earth today. Like, there's no evidence that mole men from the center of the earth exist, so you can't really use them to explain something else. So anyway, that's the basic idea of plausibility. And so as we can see, aliens built the pyramids doesn't pass the plausibility test. Alright? If you say humans built the pyramids, that passes the plausibility test, because humans are known to exist, and they're also known to build things. And so it passes the plausibility test. That doesn't mean that humans built the pyramids. But what you can do is you can go on further with your humans built the pyramids model, and then that can, if you support it more and more, then then it becomes basically an established historical fact. And so what you do what historians do is they establish various historical facts, and once certain ones have a strong deal of establishment, then they can be used as support for other historical models. So that's one of the things we're going to run into, is a lot of the time in the historical method, you're using other stuff you've proven with the historical method to prove other stuff. And so some of these methods of proving things don't rely on other historical facts, but sometimes you do have to already have historical knowledge to gain more historical knowledge. That's just the nature of the beast. So anyway, the aliens built the pyramids fails the plausibility test right off the bat. There's no evidence that aliens exist. Okay. Now, for a point of comparison, you could say, all right, how about this? Because sometimes with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Jesus being raised from the dead, sometimes people have proposed, it's often been proposed, Jesus was an alien and had abilities that we don't understand. So for example, imagine if someone like one of us was able to time travel back to Jesus' day, and we had electricity and guns and things, and they would think we were wizards with magic powers. Well, imagine someone who's far more advanced than us. That someone like that could easily perform some kind of scientific ability. Some alien from a distant planet, and Jesus could essentially come back from the dead just with superior technology. Okay, so if you say aliens brought Jesus back from the dead, or Jesus was an alien who used alien technology to come back from the dead, the problem with that is, again, there's no evidence that aliens exist. So it fails the plausibility test. There's just none. Okay, so that model just doesn't get off the ground. And see, one of the things we run into is that what we know about history kind of is regulated by how creative we are with the models. Like, in other words, can we think of some other model? But if we, so it's a matter of like, well, what model could you come up with to propose, and then could you support it, or did it lack support? Aliens raised Jesus from the dead, or Jesus was a spaceman, that kind of thing. It lacks plausibility. Now, alternatively, you could say, like, well, what about God raising Jesus from the dead? Does that have plausibility? Well, it depends. Does God exist? Well, that's where the Kalam cosmological argument and various philosophical arguments for God's existence come in, because then it's like, okay, since we can prove philosophically that God does exist, and in the case of the Kalam cosmological argument, we can actually prove that God brought every physical object into existence by his miraculous power, then that means that every single thing that you look at, its ultimate explanation for why it exists is God performed a miracle. Then what that means is, did God perform a miracle when it comes to raising Jesus from the dead? Well, God exists, and we know God has performed lots of miracles in the past. So therefore, the resurrection thesis where, God raised Jesus from the dead, that model passes the plausibility test based on philosophy. So, one of the problems you run into is you'll have historians who are highly skilled in history, but philosophy is outside of their purview, and so they'll say philosophically, I guess sophomoric would be maybe a good word. Things that in philosophy it's like, oh, laughable, a joke, and because sometimes their particular field of expertise runs crossways of philosophy, and that's when they get into trouble because they don't know anything about philosophy. Just like if a philosopher who knows nothing about history might, start jumping in and messing around, proposing historical models, it's like, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing, So that's what you run into. So, for example, Bart Ehrman, is a agnostic historian who he says he has no idea if God exists or not. He says philosophically very, very poorly thought out things that, aren't very strong. But he's one of the top experts in the world historically. So he rejects the resurrection just based on the plausibility test. It's like, for him, God, there's no reason to think God exists, and certainly no reason to think that God performs miracles. So the resurrection thesis, the resurrection model for what happened to Jesus after he was crucified just fails that plausibility, that first test. It's the same. It's on the equal footing with like aliens built the pyramids. Okay. And the general consensus of critical historians, so like liberal theologians who maybe don't believe Jesus came back from the dead, or who are atheists but still like to be called Christians, and then you've got actual atheist historians like Bart. You got Jewish historians, and I think maybe some Muslim historians. So I'm ruling out the Christian historians who think that Jesus came back from the dead, God raised Jesus from the dead. But all of the critical historians who don't think Jesus came back from the dead, they admit that there is no good model. That every model that's been proposed for what happened after Jesus died, with the whole resurrection debacle, they admit there is no good explanation for that. But they will not accept that God raised Jesus from the dead, because God's existence, it's like saying mole men from the center of the earth raised Jesus from the dead for them. But the problem is the evidence for God's existence is philosophical, and philosophy is not, that's not their field of expertise. So they might say something very dumb philosophically. So like, for example, Bart Ehrman says that he's recently blogged, and he's making philosophical claims. And one of the things he said it's impossible to know if God exists. It's like impossible to know if God exists. That is a philosophical blunder called hard agnosticism. So what he's doing is he's saying not only does he not know if God exists, but he says God is unknowable. And there's a basis for it in that God would be so far beyond our comprehension that how could we really understand God well enough to know if God exists or not? So that's where he's coming from. But this is a philosophical blunder. He has broken the second law of reason, which is the law of non-contradiction. Because by saying that he doesn't know if God exists or not, or really rather by saying that he knows that we can't know, then he knows that God is unknowable. But that means that you have to know that God is unknowable. How can you know that God is unknowable? This is a self-contradictory concept. You can't possibly know that. You have to say you don't know. And maybe he's unknowable, maybe he's knowable. I don't know. You can't say that I know this about God that I can't know anything about God. And that's just a good example of Bart Ehrman, being very careful, but also blowing it because philosophy is outside of his purview. And so that's where you run into this problem with the resurrection, for example. Now let's get back to the aliens built the pyramids, for example. One of the things you can do is let's just pretend for the sake of argument that, let's just ignore the plausibility test and just move along. Well, what we can do is we can provide a lot of support for the model where humans built the pyramids. So let's finish out and flesh out the rest of the historical method here. So we've got two other guidelines of our three general guidelines. We've talked about plausibility. Now let's talk about context and point of view. So context is essentially that the situation that the words are written into determine the meaning of the words. So for example, if you read an ancient historical document that from Greece or Rome that says, this guy, I don't know, some guy, Catavius, with some Roman name or something, or I don't know, Hercules, whoever, that he's a good guy and a leading member and an upstanding, high moral member of the community. In that context of Greece and Rome, that would mean he probably owned a lot of slaves. If you're a leading member of the community and a good person, it would mean you owned a lot of slaves. Whereas if you were to read that today and they were to say that about, somebody today, so for example, if somebody said, Donald Trump, in 2020 is a good man and a leading member of the American society, that would in no way mean that he owned slaves. In fact, it would mean the opposite, that he definitely does not own slaves. So to call somebody a good man or a bad man will mean totally different things based on the context. So this is an important general guideline. Context determines meaning in history, in the historical method. You have to always remember that within one context, what one thing will mean something totally different in another context. The same words, say he's a good man, means something totally different in one context versus another. Okay? And the other general guideline is point of view. Point of view is the thing you are most certain about in history. Essentially, when you read an ancient document, and that's what the main thing that historians work with are just things that were written down a long time ago in the past, in ancient history, about what was going on then or about what took place before. One of the things, or really the thing you are most certain about, is the point of view of the person writing it. Now you have to always recognize that your point of view, you have to try to be objective, and you have postmodern historians who say there's no such thing as objectivity, so that you're always reading your own point of view onto whatever historical document and how you interpret it. I don't buy that, really, and I think in general historians don't buy that. That debate's basically been settled, that yes, we can be objective, but at the same time, they're recognizing, here's the thing, whenever someone writes something, about history, in other words, if you read the writings of Tacitus, he talks about the Roman Empire and the past of the Roman. He's an ancient historian who lives, I think, around 110, 120 AD. He writes about what happened, what has taken place in the Roman Empire. When you tell a story, you have to pick things to put in the story, and you have to pick things to leave out of the story. You can't just put everything that happened in the story. You have to pick things. And what you pick and what you pick to put in and what you pick to leave out must be informed by your point of view. So analyzing what someone said and figuring out their point of view is really important. So we'll get into more of that, but for example, if we read Tacitus, it becomes very clear when he's writing about Nero that this guy, doesn't like Nero, Or here's another example. Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into it more as we move forward. We'll just save it for later. So those are the 3 general guidelines that you begin to test your model with, and it sort of sets up. And then you have the criteria, what's called the historical criteria. I will give you all the ones that I know, but I think there's more that they kind of vary based on field to field, but these seem like to be the big ones. But there can be more specific ones based on whatever field of history, whatever period you're working in, and that sort of thing. But the historical criteria. So you got the historical method. You've got your general data, your model, your guidelines, and then finally the criteria. The criteria function as sort of how you test your historical theory. Okay. Most of these guidelines function positively only, and that is a confusion people make. They think that lack of this criteria lack of support from a particular criteria for a model debunks a model. It doesn't, because these criteria, most of them function only positively. But the thing is, you can create an anti-model that is like directly the opposite of the original model, and then you can use the criteria positively to support the anti-model, and then they sort of can function negatively like that in a roundabout way. But the first criteria on the list is early attestation. So if you have someone saying something that agrees with your model very close, early on, very close to the time when it would have happened. So for example, if let's say Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the Ford's Theater, in Ford's Theater, and you get a newspaper clipping from the next week after that happened that said that, then that would be early attestation, because it's the next week after it happened. You have a written document saying that it happened, so that supports your model. So you come up with your model, but then early attestation like that supports your model. It's a basic way that gets your model off the ground, because plausibility isn't really enough to just get it off the ground. It's sort of our first barrier, but to really get it anywhere, you're going to have some sort of attestation. The earlier, the better. But you're going to have somebody, closer to the time that when it would have happened, saying that it happened. Okay. The next one is independent attestation, or sometimes they can be combined. You say, well, we've got early independent attestation. Independent attestation is an important test, because essentially, if you can establish, especially if you can establish a high degree of independence, then what you have are essentially, this is very similar to court cases where you have 2 witnesses saying the same thing. And sometimes, in court cases, what they'll do is they'll take the witnesses and they'll put them in separate rooms, and have them, testify without being able to sit down and chit-chat with each other and get their story straight. So the thing is, the thing about this, and about the historical method, and really how this developed, we'll go into sort of the history of the historical method. In the Middle Ages, and even in the Greek and Roman times, people had, the way the history worked is they had what were called authorities. Some guy who wrote something, and then that guy was just the authority. So during the Middle Ages, they used Josephus, they used the Gospel of Luke and Acts, John, they used Herodotus, they used Tacitus, and they were just taken at their word. That guy said it, that guy's an authority, then it's true. And that created problems for them sometimes, because sometimes the guy who's the authority would disagree with the other authority about something. But after the end of the Middle Ages, the historical method begins to be developed. It's a little bit confusing because sometimes people think of the scientific method wasn't, not being developed until after the end of the Middle Ages, but it was actually developed sort of in the middle of the Middle Ages, although there was opposition back and forth, but people kept pushing for it, and it sort of became dominant and really just blew everyone out of the water eventually at the end of the Middle Ages. But the historical method really doesn't get started until the Middle Ages end. So like basically in the 1500s, you start getting started. And you start saying, okay, we can't just read the Gospel of Luke. We can't just read Tacitus and, these ancient documents that talk about history and they talk about events that happened in the past. We can't just read them and just take them at their word. We have to have some sort of method for testing what they say to figure out, can we know if that's actually correct or not? And so that the historical method was developed. And so one of the things is, like, when it comes to the criterion of independent attestation, the issue is that if two people, in other words, if two ancient documents are lying, then what you have are two people who each wrote a lie. If you lie, then it is very unlikely that you will just happen to make up the exact same lie as someone else. So that's independent attestation. The only way that people are just going to randomly generate the exact same lie is if they got together and got their stories straight. Or they're actually relying on someone else who told it to them. But if they are really independent of one another, then it becomes very unlikely that it's not true. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, in the case of this test, we can propose a model that says that Peter and Paul were martyred for their faith as Christians. Okay, can we support this model? Well, there's early attestation from the epistle of 1 Clement, and there's one other early Christian document that claims it. And we could add other stuff, but let's just focus on those two. There's two early Christian letters that are like, I don't know, they're written like 160 to 130. They're within a few decades of the event of the supposed martyrdom of Peter and Paul in Rome. Around 65, 68 AD in Rome. Okay. All right. So we have early attestation. We have multiple early attestation. Okay. So that gets that, and of course it certainly has plausibility, and because we know that the Romans executed people for, being in the wrong religion. It wasn't implausible at all. Of course, how do you know that, Ben? Well, that's just other historical facts that have been proven through the historical method. So, for example, the cult of Isis was violently persecuted by the Romans on more than one occasion. The cult of Bacchus. And the Romans had a general problem with anyone just having meetings about anything. There's one example where in one province they want to start up a volunteer fire department, and the emperor writes back and says no, because all of he says anytime someone starts having meetings, before long it turns political. So no, you can't have meetings. He says it doesn't matter what they're meeting about, no matter how nice it seems to be, no matter how unsuspicious, before long it turns political. And most of Roman emperors were assassinated, so there's a reason to be paranoid of political groups. But anyway, here's the thing with this particular model. The Roman historian Tacitus also says that under Nero, in Rome, in the city of Rome, he persecuted Christians. And you might say, well, Nero wrote it, you know, and Clement wrote it, and I forget who the other guy is, but, you know, how do you know it's true? Well, what you do is you can use the criterion of independent attestation to establish that this probably is true. Okay, you can never say under the historical method that something definitely happened, but you can say that it's very likely. You know, you can get your probability up pretty high. They don't ever put a specific number on it, but you can basically think of it like 90%. You know, which is the best you can ever do. But you could say, like, what you do is you go back to Clement and these Christian writings, and you analyze what they wrote, and you pick up what their point of view is. And then you analyze what Tacitus wrote about Nero and his persecution of Christians, and you figure out what his point of view is. And what you do is you establish that they're coming from totally different points of view, which means that they are not collaborating together to get their story straight. This guy's not a Christian. So the thing is, when the Christians write the story, they're talking about the Christians who were martyred, who are heroes of the faith that other Christians need to look up to. So Peter and Paul are very important in First Clement and some of these others as, you know, real heroes of the faith. So their point of view is all about look up to these Christians. Whereas Tacitus's point of view, he doesn't really, it's not that he hates the Christians, it's just that they're not that important to him. What's really important to him is he hates Nero. And he's writing about how Nero was like the worst emperor ever. And he's got a political bent, and that comes through in what he's writing. He does not like Nero. Okay. And so, when he says that Nero persecuted Christians, he says the followers of Christus. And he spells, it's actually supposed to be Christus in Latin. He spells it wrong, which is a known common misspelling of Christ that pagan Romans did in that period. So that tells us that he's not collaborating with this is what we call like a high degree of independence between these sources. So it becomes very unlikely that they're collaborating together. Which means, what are the odds that they would both independently make up a story where in the same time and in the same place Christians were martyred, in the same city at the same time? You know, Tacitus focuses on Nero, and who is it? The Christians focus on Peter and Paul. But in the same time, in the same place, Christians are martyred. And Tacitus he's not concerned with who the Christians were. But we know, you know, from our general overview of history, that within that historical context, the Romans always slaughtered the leaders of religious groups, or the leaders were always the first to go. And since the Christians clearly think that Peter and Paul are their leaders, it probably happened that Peter and Paul were martyred. Okay, so it doesn't matter about anything else. This test functions positively to support this. Okay? They probably were martyred. It certainly passes the plausibility test. Romans did it all the time. It's very unlikely that these two totally independent sources would make up the same lie, and what's most likely is that the leaders of the religious group were slaughtered. So Peter and Paul probably were. Okay, so that's a little example of, you know, a historical model that gets, you know, proposed right there. Let's go back to the Egyptian pyramids, and let's look at some of our other criteria. So, one of the important criteria on the list are what's called relics or archaeology. So archaeology, you can go back and like find physical objects that are ancient, and you can date them to the correct period, and then they won't tell you a lot of detail. They won't be like a written account of what happened, but they can have a tremendous amount of weight. So you can have like, I think there's one example I forgot. I can't remember the details of it, but there were like, I think Daniel Wallace talked about this in one of his lectures, that there were like basically historical theories bouncing back and forth, argued back and forth for like 100 years, and then one little scrap of paper was found that completely like he said it consigned 100 years, like a library full of books had to be burned. I think it was like it was historical models about when the Gospel of John was written, and they found a fragment of John that was dated to like 120 AD, and because it just was way earlier than all of the theorizing had put John at, it just refuted like mountains. So for example, when it comes to the Egyptian pyramids, we have relics, we have the pyramids. And so what we can do is we can go back and we can look at the pyramids and we can say, all right, our model is that humans built the pyramids. All right, so how did the pyramids start out? Well, they start out with, essentially, they would carve down in the ground and basically build it like a sort of an apartment, a little house down in the ground for the deceased pharaoh to live inside in the afterlife. And they had all the stuff down there, as pets down there, food, bathroom, a bathtub, all this stuff. He's going to live down there and be immortal, in the afterlife in his apartment. And then on top of the hole in the ground, they would have a little pile of bricks called a mustaba. And then along comes a particular pharaoh who's very powerful and very wealthy, and he's like, I want a big mustaba. So they build this like really big mustaba. And all it is just sort of it's a pile of bricks that's sort of rectangular shaped. It's got, it's square shaped with like 2 long sides and 2 short sides. So he builds this really big mustaba, and then it's so big, it's like wide and flat, so he's like, we could build another mustaba on top of that mustaba. So then he winds up making it square so that it won't be narrow. And then he's like, expands it and builds another one on top of that one. And so that becomes the first pyramid. And it has these like steps on it. It's called the step pyramid. And it was sort of a process. And it's way less advanced than the pyramids that come later, because they're just kind of piling up small rocks. Kind of loose. It's like a loose pile of rubble. So then the next pharaoh comes along, and he's really powerful and rich. So he tries to build a pyramid that has like smooth walls without the steps. Okay? And it falls apart because it's built out of this loose rubble. And so it's the failed pyramid. So like, and then he has the next one he builds where they make the walls too steep, and then they realize it's going to fall apart. So at the top, they make the walls less steep about halfway up. It's called the bent pyramid because it like changes angle. And then he didn't like that one, so then he builds a third one, which uses bigger rocks, more carefully placed, more carefully cut, and it has like the right angle that they figured out. You got to do this angle, not any steeper, not any more shallow. This is the steepest angle you can do, and you have to make the bigger rocks, more carefully cut stones, and then it's called the red pyramid. And so you can plot a progression of failed and improved, as the engineering got better. And then you get to the pyramids of Giza, where they cut even bigger stones, and they're able to make the pyramids even taller because they're using bigger, more carefully cut, better stones. And so these relics really support the view that humans built the pyramids, and it doesn't support the view where aliens built the pyramids, because would aliens really have built all these failed pyramids and shown a slow, steady progression, how they got better and better at building pyramids? No, it doesn't. Doesn't jive with that theory. So that's just an example. Now, let's take a look at the criterion of dissimilarity. The criterion of dissimilarity is, it works like this. If you have an ancient historical document that says, so-and-so said this, it talks about somebody in the past who said so-and-so. So like if Tacitus says that Nero said this, if that is very unlike something that people would have said before that guy, and is very unlike something people would have said after that guy, then it's probably said by that guy. So if it's dissimilar, so they do this a lot with Jesus. They say, statements of Jesus that we find in the Gospels, if it's very different from the earlier Jewish context, and it's very different from the Christian context that emerged after Jesus, and essentially what we know about, those through the historical method, how we know things about that, then it's very likely that Jesus said that, or whoever, because with this, I'm not trying to prove something for you so much as showing you how this method works, because once you understand it, it's like, it sort of puts the pieces together. We all tend to have a lot of historical knowledge that we don't know how to put into sort of a framework. So that's what I'm trying to do with this video, talk about the historical method. So that's the criterion of dissimilarity. We won't talk about it too much because we're going to move on. An important one is the criterion of embarrassment. So the criterion of embarrassment is that you can tell the point of view, and that, again, point of view of the author of the text is the thing you're most certain about. But then because you know the point of view, then you can know that when the author says this, that was very embarrassing in relation to the point of view of the author. And so therefore it's very unlikely that the author would have made that up, because it's embarrassing to the point of view of the author. Since you know the author's point of view, then you know what's embarrassing to the author's point of view. Therefore you know that the embarrassing statement is probably true. Okay. Now, sometimes people make a mistake with the criterion of embarrassment, and they say that they use it negatively. So like they'll say, the Christians, like John wrote in the Gospel of John that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And John was a Christian who believed that Jesus was the Son of God. And so therefore John would be motivated to make that up because that fits with his point of view, that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. So therefore John's motivated to make that up. And so therefore John made that up. That is a misuse of the criterion of embarrassment. And it's a very common misuse of it. Bart Ehrman complains about people misusing, criterion like that. You have to understand there's a difference between negative criterion and positive criterion. So like, for example, I'll give you an alternative example. Julius Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, claims that he brought back 1 million slaves from Rome, which would be something that the Romans would have been very proud of. Within their historical context, that would have been a point of great pride in the glory of Rome. Okay, for them. Not for us today, but for them. Okay, so it wouldn't have been embarrassing at all for him to claim that. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen, because the bottom line is things can happen that fit with your point of view or fit with the historian's point of view. It doesn't mean that the author's point of view is necessarily untrue just because he or she says something happened that fits with the point of view. It could be that, that's just the way it happened. And, think about it, like, people are probably going to make their point of view fit with reality. They're not going to have one that's completely out of touch with reality. Okay. So anyway, here's an example of a proper use of the criterion of embarrassment. I'll give you 2 examples. The Roman historian Tacitus talks about an entire Roman legion was defeated by the barbarians in the Teutoburg forest, the Germans. Well, it's clear from what Tacitus tells us that he is very racist. against the barbarians, and he says things about them that we know are not true. So, for example, he says that their swords and their axes are made of a much poorer quality steel than Roman swords and axes, which we know that isn't true. We thought it was true for a long time until we found relics of their weapons, and we had relics of Roman weapons to compare to, and we found that they clearly had far better steel. So, even though the Romans were dominant over them militarily for centuries, it must have been because of, better military organization or something. It wasn't because of better weapons, because the Germanic peoples had better weapons. And Tacitus calls them barbarians, which was a racial slur. He's very racist, He says things that are absurd. So he says that, like, they go around naked with nothing but like a sheet on, just a cloak on, that's only clasped at the neck, and it's just like flowing in the wind. Their whole front side is just full frontal nudity, except for like the little neck clasp. And that fails. That particular point that he makes fails the criterion of I guess science is what I call it. In other words, like general scientific knowledge of things that we know. So we just know from science that, like, people just can't go around in the frozen north of Germany and Scandinavia with nothing but a cloak on that's just like clasped on at the neck. No, we just know that's nonsense. I'll give you another example of that as we get later on. But my point is, we can very clearly pick up Tacitus's point of view that he's very racist against these Germans. So it's very embarrassing for him to talk about the defeat in the Teutoburg Forest, where an entire Roman legion is defeated by these Germans. It's the one defeat for the great emperor Augustus. The period of Roman greatness that begins when Augustus becomes emperor also has this big, black mark on it where they get beaten by these ignorant barbarians. And since that's so embarrassing for his point of view, it probably happened. The defeat in the Teutoburg Forest probably happened. Okay, because he wouldn't make that up. Or at least Tacitus thinks it happened, and Tacitus would be in a position to know. And it would be very unlikely that Tacitus would have been fooled into thinking something like that happened. But in the case of that particular battle, we have found relics of it. So they went back and they had to look, and it wasn't in exactly the spot where we thought it was. It was hard to tell, Farmland changes over the centuries. But that's just an example. Let me give you another example. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew reports that the Jews are spreading a story about the Christians. And the Jews are saying that the disciples stole Jesus' body and are going around saying, in other words, Jesus' body was in the tomb. The disciples went in the night, stole the body, got rid of it, and then went around telling everyone that the tomb was empty. Okay. Given the point of view of Matthew, it's very unlikely that he would make that up. In other words, it's very unlikely that Matthew would just introduce a story where the apostles stole the body. It's unlikely that Matthew would make up a story about the apostles stealing the body. Matthew wouldn't make that up. That's very embarrassing for his point of view. Therefore, it's probably true that the Jews were in fact saying that. He reports it because it's true. The Jews were saying that the apostles stole the body. But, given that the Jews were saying that, alright, and there's other ways we can establish they were saying that in Jerusalem, the Jews wouldn't have said the apostles stole the body unless the tomb was in fact empty. Because if the tomb wasn't empty, the Jews would have just said, Jesus is not back from the dead, here's his body. Okay? Here's his body. So, you've got an empty tomb to explain with Jesus. It is an established historical fact. The consensus of historians agrees. The tomb was empty. Critical historians, everyone. The tomb was empty. It's an established historical fact. Matthew, based on this, Matthew wouldn't have made that up. So that means that the Jews were saying that, and the Jews wouldn't have made that up either, given their point of view. So the tomb was empty. And there's other ways to go about establishing that, but that's just one really strong example of that. And so what that does, for example, is you can say, all right, so here's an example. I've given you a basis for saying that probably Peter and Paul were martyred for their faith. Okay, so why would they be willing to die for, their belief in Jesus? Well, because they thought it was true. I mean, it's unlikely that they were doing it for some selfish reason if they were willing to be executed for it. But they were in a position to... Why would they think it was true? I mean, they claimed that they saw Jesus, Jesus appeared to them. He made a resurrection appearance to them. So, well, you could just say they're crazy, that they hallucinated that. Well, one of the problems with a hallucination theory is that the tomb was in fact empty, and that's an established historical fact. So it's like, alright, a hallucination alone does not explain what happened to the body. And the Jews wouldn't have made that up, given their point of view. So, the tomb was empty. So what happened to the body? Okay? You could say the apostles stole the body, but then that runs into the problem of why would they go to their death when they knew that they went and got the body and stole it like that? Okay, so that just gives you sort of, a general gist of how this works. Alright? Let's move on to the next criteria. Contradiction. This is the one criteria that functions negatively. So, when you have the accounts or the attestation or the ancient documents that talk about an event and they contradict one another about the event, then that functions negatively about the model. So for example, let's talk about Peter and Paul's execution. Them being martyred for their faith. We have earlier documents that essentially confirm for us that they were martyred for their faith. But then, I think it's 100 or 200 years later, we have other documents that detail the story of exactly how it went down. And so they're not super early attestation, but they're still significantly early, because still being a couple hundred years after the event is not nothing. It's not as good as being a few decades after the event or a few days after the event or something like that. But so it's not nothing. But then the issue is that those later accounts that detail the story of how Peter and Paul were executed disagree greatly on the details of how it happened. And so what that does is if your model is that Peter was executed upside down or something like that, since you've got other accounts that disagree with that, it's hard, you've got disagreement within the models. In other words, when you have contradictions like that, somebody has to be lying. You could say that only one of them is telling the truth, or you could say none of them are. But essentially, contradiction is like the reverse of independent attestation. If you have multiple truly independent accounts that are saying the same thing, it's unlikely that they just happen to make up the same thing. But if they're just making stuff up, then it's more likely that they'll contradict one another. They won't say exactly the same thing. So This is an example of how this is often used is when it comes to the resurrection and the Gospels and how they talk about Jesus's, that people talk about contradictions, that they tell the story completely different, they contradict one another on how it went down. It is a bit debatable. They do kind of stretch. So here's an example of a contradiction they talk about. They say that in Luke, Jesus is more talkative, and in Mark, Jesus is more, he doesn't say so much when he's going to the cross. So that's a contradiction. That's like a big one they talk about. The problem with that particular contradiction is, and what they're doing is they're saying, my model is that the people who wrote Mark and Luke didn't really have much connection to much information about the actual Jesus. And then the criteria they use to support that. In other words, they're saying it was written much later by people who didn't really know any of the eyewitnesses. These were stories that were handed down. In other words, like what, this is one of Bart's general model is that, like, Mark was written around AD 60, and then John written, AD 90, and so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Acts are all written, 60 to 90, and that's 30 years after Jesus would have died. So I think they say 70 to 90. So that's 40, 40 years. And so they say people just pass down the teachings of Jesus word of mouth, the things Jesus said, and word of mouth, and then it got changed over time because people were just passing it down word of mouth for 4 decades, and then eventually it got written down in 40 to 60 years after the events. And so he supports that model by saying, in one story in Luke you have a very talkative Jesus as he's being crucified, as he's being on his trial and all that, and in Mark you have a very hush Jesus. Okay, so I mean that's how that works. He's proposing a model, and then he's supporting it with the criteria. Now, and what it does is it functions negatively, and it says, these guys don't really know anything about, what Jesus actually said. The thing about that, the way I guess conservative Christian historians respond to that is they say Jesus could have been a complicated guy, and there could have been a lot about his personality that they wanted to focus on, so these aren't necessarily a contradiction. He could have been, a gigantic figure in a sense, and there could have been a lot to talk about. So that helps, that kind of talks about that. And then I do want to talk about the criterion of science a little bit more. So another example of how that works is from science. Sociological science has demonstrated no examples of mass conversions. And in fact, if we look at historical in other words, a large group of people all converting to a new religion in like one religious meeting after like hearing a sermon or something, there are actually no confirmed examples of that. Human social science, like these Billy Graham crusades where like tons of people come down the aisle, it's all people who were already Christians, rededicating their life, or they were already part of that, and they're reaffirming and reinvigorating their commitment. All social science research indicates that conversion is a slow process that happens person to person through relationships, and that preaching to large audiences doesn't cause mass conversions. Mass conversions just don't happen. You might have a few who convert on the spot, but in general, what most people who convert to a new religion convert through relationships in their life, not through just, the hearing it for the first time by the preacher. And there's no examples in all historical documents that even claim that mass conversions happened. Which is interesting because for a long time historians said, well, look at how Christianity overtook the Roman Empire. It must have been through mass conversions. There must have been many mass conversions. There's no other way to explain the explosive growth. Okay? There's only one actual historical document that even claims a mass conversion happened, and it's the one in Acts, where Peter preaches on Pentecost and 3,000 people are saved. If that happened, it would have been a sociological miracle. Because it's just like, what we know from human social sciences, that just doesn't happen. Okay, so for a long time, everyone said, well, it must have happened all the time, because that's how Christianity grew so much. And then, Rodney Stark famously put the nail in that coffin. He actually did the math. He said no one had done the math. And he did the math, and he said, given the data points we know how many of the Christians there were here, 30 years later, 50 years later, 60 years later, we have all these data points where we know how many Christians there are at each of these points. And then he said, can I come up with a formula that predicts this growth and fits this curve of growth? It turns out 3.4%, I think, per year fits it. So all you have to do is, for every 100 Christians, every year they convert about 3.5. Sometimes more, sometimes less. And you will match that growth curve. And the thing is, that's an exponential growth curve, so it's confusing because, at the beginning, around 313 AD, when Constantine's emperor, at the beginning of the 300s, you've only got, I think it's 6% of the empire is Christian. But then 50 to 60 years later, you've got half the empire, or a little over half the empire, are now Christians. And people said, well, Constantine must have, threatened people with violence to make them convert. How do we explain this explosive growth? Well, it turns out science explains it based on pure mathematics and what we know from social science. Basic relationship, 3.4% a year. Once you reach sort of a tipping point, the curve starts to grow very dramatically. So if you can, it's just like investing money in the stock market. If you invest a small amount of money and then it keeps growing at a very steady rate, then eventually it sort of reaches a tipping point where the growth becomes very explosive. And so the math works out. So it turns out, if historians say that Constantine forced a bunch of people to become Christians, the problem is the curve didn't change. It followed the exact same growth curve that it had followed for centuries, and it didn't speed up and it didn't slow down. He had no effect on it. He only had an effect on a lot of rich people wanting to become bishops, because all of a sudden the emperor was now funding the church, and so they could make money. So he had an effect on that, but the overall growth curve, he had no effect on it. So anyway, that sometimes scientific knowledge comes in as sort of an outside test that really can help. Another example is with hallucinations. There's no evidence that anyone has ever hallucinated something creatively. So, for example, if I talked to a young man one time, and he, teenage boy, he's claimed that he sees demons. He sees demons. I'm sitting here recording this video on Halloween. We're talking about this kid seeing demons. Hey, that's what he said. He sees demons. Okay. Well, demons are, he's creative in the sense that he's talking about this experience he had. But the whole idea, the underlying concept, is not creative. He's heard of demons before. He's seen movies about demons. Other kids, adults have talked to him about demons. He's read about demons in the Bible. He's, and that they're invisible, that people see them, the whole 9 yards, all of that, none of those are new ideas. He's not actually creating a new idea. It's well known from psychology, humans don't hallucinate creatively. Rather, they hallucinate things they already want to be true, they are already steeped in. So then, for example, if you say that Peter and Paul hallucinated Jesus coming back from the dead, there's a criterion that really functions negatively against that, which is those would have been creative hallucinations. Given the historical context, there is just... it's totally dissimilar from everything that came from before it. Like, it's... given what we know about the historical context, there was just no... they had no concept of a Messiah that would be executed. Period. And they had no concept of God raising the Messiah from the dead, and and any of this meaning anything. The whole concept of Christianity comes out of the blue. So there are... historians did really try to push the hallucination theory, and it really was the last theory to die, the hallucination model. So at first, historians just claimed the apostles stole the body, and then that model died. When I say at first, I mean like in the 1700s. And then they started claiming, well, Jesus faked it, But then science debunked that one. It was like, well, it's kind of hard to fake, your death by crucifixion. Like, you probably really did. Okay, and the one with the apostles, the apostles stole the body and lied about it. I mean, that runs into a problem of they were willing to die. And so you have the next one that they proposed was the legendary theory, that it was just a big legend. The problem, so a legend is a legend is something that's added to slowly over time, and you have many centuries where the story grows and gets embellished. The problem with that one is we were able to date, through various historical methods, we were able to date the story of the resurrection to anywhere from 5 to 15 years at the latest after Jesus' death. So that's just not enough time for legendary embellishment. It's right here with the people who claim to see the resurrection. That's not really a legend. They were there. It's not a story that grows over the centuries. So the resurrection theory died, and the last one to die was the hallucination theory, where you say, well, the apostles hallucinated, and it runs into all sorts of problems. One of the problems is the empty tomb, like we talked about, and I guess you could say that some of the apostles stole the body while other ones hallucinated. The problem is those who stole the body, they would have been in a position to know that they would have been putting their lives on the line. It was to be expected. So there's not much motivation to do that. It's not going to work out well for you, given what we know. In addition to that, it's not likely that they would have hallucinated a new idea creatively like that. So there's just a lack of evidence. And there's one more test to talk about. I can't believe I forgot this one. We got to add it in there. And it's lack of competing tradition. Lack of competing tradition. This essentially is an argument from silence. So for example, all of the information we have about the apostles, about Christianity, about the relationship with Jesus, is totally silent about them, and everything we know about the Jewish context in which they were in, and we've established that that was a big shift in understanding the apostles. Everything about them we've established historically must be within a Jewish context. So Greek ideas, we can't interpret what they say through Greek ideas. We have to interpret it through Jewish ideas. It's called the Great Jewish Reclamation of Jesus, or Jesus scholarship, historical Jesus scholarship. So the point is, within that Jewish context, and all the information we have about the apostles, there just is no attestation. There is nothing coming to us today about them expecting a dying and rising Messiah. So they wouldn't hallucinate it. It is an established historical fact. Through one of the criteria is the lack of competing tradition. Now, the lack of competing tradition, you have to be careful, because it is an argument from silence. An argument from silence is a logical fallacy, but only in certain conditions. So in other words, you're saying, well, no one ever said that, so, in other words, like, you have a particular view, and you have multiple ancient accounts that support that view, and you have no one that says anything other than that view, then that will be a lack of competing tradition. So, for example, with the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, there is no other story other than that they were martyred for their faith. There just is no other alternative view. So, when it comes to these hallucinations, it's like there is no other view that comes to us where they would have been in a context where they would have hallucinated it. It's just completely out of their purview. So we know from science that they wouldn't have hallucinated it. Well, then the issue becomes like, okay, well, isn't that an argument from silence? Just because the historical records don't bear witness to something, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. That is true. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about the past. We have very scant information. A lot of historical documents, like 90% of them probably, at least, of ancient documents were lost to time. They just rotted away and no one recopied them. In some cases they were destroyed. And then a lot of stuff just wasn't written down. So if you're going to use a lack of competing tradition as a historical criteria, what you have to do is also establish that there should have been a competing tradition. So in other words, if your model is that the apostles hallucinated Jesus' resurrection, then you have to give some sort of reason why the competing tradition was lost. Or you can think of it this way. If your model is that there's no way they hallucinated, then you're going to have to say, if it gets confusing, if they hallucinated, there should have been a competing tradition that talks about their prior belief in a dying and rising Messiah. That record of their belief should not have been lost out, given what we know. So in other words, like, what you would have had were apostles who were already expecting it, who somehow vanished from the records. Apostles who got it right. I brought this up to someone in a debate forum, and he said, well, Jesus told them that he was going to die and rise from the grave. Yes, but that doesn't explain why the apostles would have hallucinated. For the apostles to have hallucinated, they would have had to have believed that, already been expecting that, already been at least liking the idea. And so, why would their prior hope and belief in this have vanished from the records? That's the key. It wouldn't have vanished from the records. So if you can establish that the competing tradition should not have vanished from the records, then the lack of competing tradition becomes a historical criteria. So given what we know about their context and everything, and the lack of competing tradition, they didn't hallucinate. And in fact, there's only one historian I know of. His name's Gerd Ludemann. He's a German New Testament scholar. He's like the one holdout who still defends the hallucination theory. And what he does is he tries to find actual evidence for the prior psychological state within Peter and Paul that would have caused them to hallucinate. Because again, Peter and Paul are the ones that we can say probably they were martyred for their faith. And so then he's got them hallucinating. And he says Peter experienced guilt about his denial of Jesus. And that set up the prior psychological state that would have caused him to want to believe this. That's his argument. It's a kind of a weak argument because it doesn't explain why Peter jump to the belief that Jesus was the Messiah and died for our sins and all of that. It's still a creative hallucination. He's got a similar problem with Paul, a slightly different problem with Paul. He says that Paul felt guilt about all the Christians he was executing. And the problem is there's no evidence for that. It lacks all support. So like everything Paul tells us about who he was before he became a Christian was that he was very proud of himself for persecuting Christians and that he was the best Jew ever, and that his transformation into becoming a Christian comes out of the blue. He's just blown away by it. Seeing the risen Jesus is this total game changer for him. And in fact, the critical historian Bart Ehrman goes so far as to say he doesn't think Jesus came back from the dead, but he says something happened when it comes to the resurrection, and he uses the resurrection in his general model to explain how the Christians transformed their view of Jesus. He says whatever it was that happened, that was what changed them into thinking that Jesus was God. Because he says, what he says is, if you look in Philippians, right there, you can date Paul's high view of Christ that's right there in Philippians to, again, very early after the resurrection, after the death of Jesus. And so Bart, of course, doesn't believe in the resurrection because he says it's implausible because, God doesn't, there's no evidence for God's existence and therefore no evidence for miracles. So he rules out the resurrection. But he says very clearly he doesn't know what happened. But then he goes on to say something must have happened, although he doesn't know what. He just takes the I don't know card. But something happened. And that something caused them to have a completely new view of Jesus where he's God. Or I think what he says in his model is they immediately thought Jesus was some sort of demigod. And he talks about how within the Jewish context they did have a view of like a divine figure that's like a sub god under God, like an angel, but higher than the angels. He builds that whole point out of Jewish prophecies and establishes it within Jewish context. And so, anyway, that's his general model, and that's how he supports it there. But anyway, my point that I'm making is that what appears to be clear is that it's very hard to get around the resurrection. So like when it comes to Egyptians and the pyramids, a lot of times people like to say, well, we have no explanation for how the pyramids were built, so therefore we've got to go for implausible models like aliens. It's like, actually, we've got really good plausible models for how they were built. The Egyptians left us records for how they moved the blocks. They used sleds, but they poured water on the sand in front of the sleds. We tried that out, and it turns out it's pretty easy to pull these blocks on sleds as long as you wet the sand, and you can even pull them up fairly steep ramps. And we found out how they quarried the rocks. They didn't use copper chisels to quarry them out. They used pickaxes with like a hard type of stone tip on them, and it totally works. We tried it out; it totally works. They can quarry them out. How do they cut them and shape them? Well, we found out that you can take a copper blade on a bandsaw and pour sand on the cut, and the sand essentially has like carbide in there, and so it's one guy's pouring sand on the cut. You're essentially using a carbide tip blade, and you can cut right through a huge, one of these huge stones. And they even flatten them out with sand. They put sand on the rock, and they take a smooth rock from the river and flatten it out, sanding down the high spots. So anyway, that being said, we might as well stop. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time. Hey, I need to jump back in here and clarify a couple of things. First of all, First Clement was the date that's given is probably 96 AD. That's the date for First Clement. And remember, First Clement is a Christian document that testifies to the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. In addition to that, I needed to make a point about plausibility and how that works, because that could become a bit confusing. So here's the thing. Let's go back to the pyramids in Egypt. Okay, if you are using aliens as an explanation for how the pyramids were built, as part of the historical method to understand history of the pyramids, then that fails the plausibility test, because we're using something that we have no evidence that it exists, i.e. aliens, to explain something from history. But alternatively, you could be talking about a totally different argument that's not really part of the historical method, but may appear to be, or it's kind of related, but it's not really part of understanding history. You could be making a different argument where you say the proof for the existence of aliens is the pyramids. Okay, that is not really a historical argument, although it sort of is, but you're really going into a different question about, the existence of aliens. So, plausibility can be confusing, because if you're using something to explain something else, then that's something you need to be using something that's already known to be plausible. But if you're trying to establish the plausibility of that thing, then that's a very different point. So if you're trying to use the pyramids to establish the plausibility of aliens, or the existence of aliens, then that would be an inference to the best explanation type of argument, where you're saying the best explanation for the existence of the pyramids is aliens. Then in that situation, aliens don't run into the plausibility problem at all. The problem is, it's not really the best explanation for the existence of the pyramids, because we have ancient documents from close to the time that talk about humans building the pyramids. We have their earlier crude pyramids, their first one that's very crude. Then we have their failed pyramids that fall apart, and then the crooked ones, and then finally they figure it out, and then they start making way better ones. So anyway, that is a bit confusing. So if you're trying to use aliens to explain the pyramids, to sort of support your model for how the pyramids were built, then that fails the plausibility test. But if you're using the pyramids to prove the existence of aliens, then that doesn't really fail the plausibility test, because that's the whole point, is you're trying to establish the plausibility of aliens with an inference to the best explanation of the pyramids. Now, let's make it more confusing. Sometimes people they really confuse this point when it comes to the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. The Kalam cosmological argument starts with the beginning of the universe, and sometimes people object and they say you can't use God to explain the beginning of the universe, because you have to already have proven that God exists. There's no evidence that God exists, so therefore you can't use God to explain the beginning of the universe. That doesn't work at all. The problem with that is the Kalam cosmological argument is a proof for God's existence. So it's not using God to explain something else. And it's even more complicated than that. When it comes to the Kalam cosmological argument, that type of argument is not an inference to the best explanation that we have for something. Rather, it's a deductive argument. It is a deduction of the only explanation that is possible. So there is a difference between an inference to the best explanation that we can come up with versus a deduction of the only possible explanation. So for example, with the beginning of the universe, you could say, well, either the universe has always been here, or there's no such thing as time, or the universe had a beginning. And you can deduce that it must be one of those three. There are no other options logically. So it's not the best explanation. It's the only three explanations. And then if you can rule out an infinitely old universe for mathematical reasons, you could say that one's logically impossible. You have other philosophical problems with illusory time. Therefore, logically, you can deduce that the only possible explanation is that the universe had a beginning. So that can be a bit confusing. The Kalam cosmological argument, people think they think there's a plausibility problem because you have to prove God's existence before you use the Kalam. But the Kalam is used to prove God's existence. And even then, it's not an inference to the best explanation like what people do, with aliens and the pyramids. No, it's a deduction of the only possible explanation. So, it's not the best explanation we can come up with for, the existence of the universe. It's the only possible explanation that there can possibly be, which is a very different thing. So, in a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In an inference to the best explanation, you're just saying it's probably true, or the evidence leads us to this conclusion, not that it absolutely, inescapably has to be true. And then but there's a difference when you start using something to explain something else and you haven't proven the existence of that original something. So, as I said before, using aliens to explain the pyramids fails the plausibility test. But if you're trying to use the pyramids to prove the existence of aliens, that's a very different argument. It's a totally different point you're trying to prove, although it can sound very similar as people talk about it. And sometimes people sort of talk past one another because they speak ambiguously on these points, and they have, fruitless arguments. So anyway, hopefully that clears that up. Thank you for this extra bit of your time.